Just the cloud. Okay, welcome everybody. Today is May 26th, 2022. See if I can get the year right. And this is our third meeting for the OpenMRM community. And today we have a big agenda and lots of topics to go through, including John Hill is going to present some of his findings on the challenges with MRM, and we'll do that after a quick review of just some housekeeping. I'm Josh Bottom, and I work as one of the co-organizers of the community. And we have an agenda here that we'll walk through. So first, I'd like to just kind of go through some community updates and give folks that may be new to the community a chance to say hello. I know we saw some folks from One Convergence, but there's other folks that might want to just say hello and introduce themselves. Anybody would like to raise their hand, say hello?
I guess I've already done my introduction. This is Hemant Ravi for people who joined late. So work for One Convergence, or D-Cube is our product. So we do an MLOps product for model training, deployment, and monitoring.
Fantastic. Well, welcome.
Thanks.
All right, I'm going to keep going down the list, and if anybody else wants to say hello or just present any ideas, again, freeform kind of offer here to add items to the agenda. One of the things that I did want to try to do, I believe David had been kind enough to provide some different options for a logo. And if we were to measure these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, let's just call it that way. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This has been open for a little bit. If people had opinions on of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe we can go around and either take comments now, or maybe we can put opinions in the Slack channel and just vote on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Any opinions? David, you looked at this and kind of put these together. Is there anyone that you like the best?
I'm actually not too sure what I like. So perhaps my contribution is 6 options, and I'll let other people decide.
I kind of like 6, you know. I don't know if other people have a different opinion, but.
No, 6 would be my first choice too, because it's colorful. But I don't like the white background. I would put some kind of light pastel in the background, because that white creates screen wash. A little hard on the eyes.
I sort of like the cleanness and simplicity of the first one.
Okay.
I was going to go for the 4th, D, just because the color, the ones with colors, was looking like Google colors. So I thought. So this is open, right? Be more neutral.
No, we don't want to get sued by Google.
I'm either 3 or 4. I like 3 or 4 on either of those.
Fantastic. All right, so we've got anybody else?
Yeah, I just want to say I'll go with 3 or 4 too.
3 or 4, okay.
The black and white, the first 3 are just boring. You know, black and white. The color is more interesting.
This one's a little blue background. I would be, 3. I kind of like, or 4. This one here.
Would it be possible to evolve the third option? Maybe do like the centering like in the first one, and then maybe add a degree of color from like, maybe not the exact coloring in the 6th one, but like a variation to that, or maybe like the 5th one, so that there's like a gradation. So that would be like kind of like a none of the above / like morphing some of elements that people are responding to and liking across the 6.
I like that. Yeah, obviously it is. I think that let's think about how to do this. David, you had someone help you with this, right?
Yeah, I have a designer. I could ask him to make a change or two.
All right, from what I'm hearing, unless there seems to be kind of consensus around 3 or 4, right? And maybe a variation of 3 or 4, and maybe some special with 6 in there, but 3 or 4, does that seem about right?
Yeah, I like 3, but if we can have it in the pattern the way 4 is.
David,
So what do you like about?
go ahead.
So 3, I mean, 3 looks balanced, meaning like, open the way it is written, like on the side. But I was thinking if we can have it with the white background, or the way John suggested, maybe with a different color than the white and blue right now.
Okay. Sounds like we might want a few options.
All right, I'm just going to say 3 or 4 with some options. David, I don't want to put this on your list, but since you have the content, is it okay if I just
Yeah.
to review? Okay. All right, let's keep going. All right, there's an update and papers from John. I guess we'll jump into, you know what, John, I'm going to come back to this real quick. I want to see if we can just skip through a couple of these community updates, and then we'll come back and give you the floor. Is that okay?
That's fine. Get the housekeeping out of the way first.
Okay. Gerard, are you here? I see you online.
Yeah, hi John, hi everyone. Yeah, I'm here.
I'm glad to hear your voice. I hope that you're on the mend and doing on the upswing.
Yeah.
I think since you've been out a bit, probably no updates to the vision board, but anything that you want to give an update on the vision board, or any comments you want to give there real quick?
No, not really, Josh, anything from my side. I think I would have to work upon it further, and then maybe talk about it in next meeting.
Okay, fantastic. Well, good to see you here. On these upcoming or recent conferences, anybody would like to add something to this list, or something like fine if you want to put stuff that's kind of further out, but is there anything coming up in the next week or so that folks might want to be aware of? Please feel free to add it in here.
Mentioned that there is also going to be a Quant Minds conference. That's kind of a sister to Risk Minds, but it's aimed at higher level of management. That also will be in Barcelona, I believe, either in November or December.
Okay.
It's called, wait a minute, you have got Risk Minds there. I was thinking of Quant Minds, I guess. Quant Minds is scheduled for Barcelona as well. There's a difference between Quant Minds and Risk Minds. Quant Minds, as the name suggests, is for quants. Risk Minds is aimed more at higher level management at firms. And I want to try to present at Risk Minds this year because I want to direct my presentation on the history of model risk to a higher managerial level. I presented at Quant Minds last year.
Got it. Makes sense.
Maybe a little last minute, but there's also the R Finance conference, which is I believe June 3rd and 4th in Chicago.
What's the name of it again?
R, like the R, the programming language, finance. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Chris. All right. All good stuff. If you have stuff to add in there, I think it's really great. I'm going to move on. Community growth metrics. Again, looking at Slack traffic and members, as well as GitHub stars, folks, and people watching. I think the GitHub stars, forks, and people watching will grow if we actually start publishing some code. The Slack traffic is up quite a bit. It was interesting, and I'll see if I can do this later to show kind of some of the companies that seem to be watching the LinkedIn posts. And I mean, there were a lot from many of the financial institutions, and I mean, like 25 or 3,500 people viewed some of the posts. So, I mean, it is something that seems to be growing at an increasing rate in terms of interest. I do think that we have to keep the topics relevant. And to that end, we did talk about potentially doing a community survey, you know, what members would want from the community. I think that was kind of highlighted in some of Agus's Slack messages in the general Slack channel. And, you know, perhaps there are some decisions around model agent design, as well as some of the other things we may want to talk about if we're going to do some type of POC, which we'll get to later. The last thing before we go to John's is really talking about, you know, future agenda topics. If folks want to present to the community, I think there was this, I may have copied this down, Ryan, but this computational biology, this paper that Jacob published, as well as the FDA request, the RFI that came from the Federal Food and Drug Administration. I thought it was very interesting to see that other verticals, so to speak, might be, you know, very much interested in some of the topics that John's going to go over in the 14 challenges. I think kind of map into some of the stuff that we saw in Jacob's paper. And Jacob's paper, if you haven't looked at it, had quite a bit of contribution and review. So it was very extensive. With that, I'm going to hand it over to John. And as John's getting ready, again, if anybody has a topic or a paper or something they want to review with the organization here, please feel free to either contact me or put it into the agenda, and we'll get you a time slot. John, are you about ready?
I am.
All right,
get
fantastic.
started here.
And thank you, John. If you would introduce yourself and your background, and then, you know, that would be great, just so it's recorded for people who may not be here.
Yeah, let me get the slides up first. I actually have one slide that gives my whole bio, but let me swap this. Okay. So I'm an adjunct professor of financial risk engineering at NYU. Currently, I've had a career spanning over 20 years and working in various areas of risk management, and particularly model risk at first at Citi, at Salomon Smith Barney, which became Citi Group. And then I moved to Morgan Stanley, where I started a model validation team there for validating the market and operational risk models, all the CCAR models that were used with Morgan Stanley. I led that team for 7 years. And then I moved to Credit Suisse to work in governance, which broadened my exposure to the many problems of model discipline that extend well beyond just the validation process. And that led to this topic, one of the topics I'm going to discuss today, which I call the 14 challenges for model risk managers, because validation of models is just one of the many challenges involved. Starting with this, I should apologize in advance. The presentation I'm giving you today, I cobbled together from 4 or 5 different PowerPoint presentations. So the formats may not be consistent from slide to slide, but the content is what's relevant. I use different visual means for model risk. And when I gave a talk in Japan, I used this one, which is called The Great Wave by Hokusai. It's a very famous painting in Japan. And if you look closely, you'll see there's some ships here with some very nervous fishermen who are about to be swept away by the tsunami. And to me, that also gives a great representation of the challenges of model risk management, because I'll give you plenty of examples where firms, and in some cases, lives were swept away by model risk tsunamis. Interesting thing about this painting is the visual reference between this wave on the left, lower left, and Mount Fuji in the background, which was a consistent theme in Hakusai's paintings. So let me move on from that. I want to start by bringing your attention to the fact that model risk is most like operational risk rather than the other forms of financial risk, market credit, liquidity risk, because it occurs in every realm of human activity that requires some form of technology. So I'm just going to give you some brief examples. These are extracted from a much longer presentation I give on the history of model risk, just to give you a quick walkthrough of how many varieties of model risk appear in different realms of human activity. The lower part of this, I have a link to a full-length presentation that I recorded for the Model Risk Managers International Society about a year ago. This is a very brief view of that. So model risk appeared in 1628 at the launch of the world's mightiest warship. In 1628, the mighty Vasa, which was the most powerful warship of its day, capsized minutes after being launched due to a simple and very classic modeling error, which was linear extrapolation on a convex function. As I say, if a modeling error, simple modeling error could sink the mightiest warship of its era, just imagine what it can do to your firm today. Model risk appeared at the bottom of Galway of Roundstone Bay in Galway, Ireland in 2004, where this hapless crane operator underestimated the weight of the car that he was trying to lift out of the bay and ended up losing his crane as well. So we'll get an example of nautical related model risk, and you'll see a few more of those. This crane operator clearly underestimated the weight because he probably used the dry weight of the car he was trying to lift, and he didn't consider the weight of the seawater that was held inside the car. Model risk is an invisible companion in autonomous vehicles. This is the classic example of a Waymo vehicle that ran down a woman who was walking a bicycle across an intersection. And even though there was someone at the wheel of the Waymo vehicle who was supposed to be monitoring it, apparently they were distracted watching Hulu or something on their iPad. And this Uber test vehicle did not recognize the image of a woman and bicycle together, which just seems ridiculous. But I'll identify some other problems in what I view as lack of proper testing of these autonomous vehicles, which will hopefully make you very reluctant to use autonomous driving anytime in the near future. Tesla automobiles also have a number of accidents, like this one that ran into a highway divider while the operator was apparently distracted or reading a newspaper. This is one of the most egregious cases. This video was taken from a Tesla vehicle just before the car impacted the trailer that you see on that rig ahead. In this case, this really typifies some of the problems with testing of these complex systems. You see that you can see from this image that the side of the van is almost the same color as the gray of the sky. This was very early in the morning. It turns out the driver of the Tesla vehicle had gone on to autopilot just 10 seconds before he impacted the side of that trailer. And apparently the visual recognition software could not distinguish the side of this trailer from the sky, and the result was tragedy. The driver was killed instantly. The impact point is right here on that area that's circled on the right, and you can see the whole top of the Tesla vehicle was sheared off. This was one of the most egregious examples of too much trust put in autonomy.
Come here and show you.
Hello? Got a question?
Hey, no, I think Manjo, if you might mute it, thanks.
Model risk was an invisible passenger on a Mars climate orbiter. This orbiter crashed into Mars in 1998 because someone forgot to convert metric orbital calculations into the English units that were required for thrust calculations. It's another classic example of model risk, failure to convert input into the proper units. Last was this, to me, one of the most egregious examples of model risk. It was an invisible passenger on the Boeing 737 MAX 8 that took the lives of 346 passengers and crew in 2 different crashes in 2018 and 19. This jet was introduced in 2017 and 2018. The Lion Air plane, Lion Air 737 MAX crashed into the Indian Ocean. And 4 months later, Boeing neglected or refused to ground the aircraft, even though there were plenty of indications there was some problem with the stability control software on board. The CEO of Boeing went on Fox News and announced that he had complete confidence in the safety of this aircraft, only to see another one crash in a very similar way 4 months later in Ethiopia. This all resulted from last-minute changes that was made to software that whose impact was not thought out and was never tested. No one at Boeing considered what would happen if the newly modified flight control software, which was called MCAS, became activated at cruising speeds due to a damaged angle of attack sensor. MCAS was something that ran as a silent background process. It was unknown to the pilots or the airlines because Boeing chose not to tell anyone about its existence, including the FAA, to avoid going through another 6 months of testing and flight simulator training. But this MCAS was a sort of a silent monster that could suddenly seize control of the aircraft. And so the net result was a set of last-minute untested modifications to critical software. It took 346 lives. The plane was finally grounded after the second crash, but that doesn't do anything to take back the lives of the people that trusted their safety to Boeing. This should give anyone pause about getting onto a Boeing 737 MAX 8. I personally will never fly on one, despite Boeing's assurances that all these problems have been fixed. In 1960, NORAD headquarters present another example of model risk. Based on radar data from Greenland, computers at the military's headquarters warned with 99.9% certainty that the USSR had just launched a massive surprise nuclear missile attack. And the officers at NORAD had only a few minutes to decide whether or not to notify the president that the United States was about to receive a nuclear barrage from Russia. But this is really why we should care about model risk management, because it turned out that this was simply a computer error. NORAD command had only a few minutes to decide what to do, but fortunately those officers read the newspapers and watched television, and they knew at that very time, that same week in 1960, Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier at the time, was actually at the United Nations in New York banging his shoe on a table. That's a photograph of him actually banging his shoe. And they concluded that the USSR was unlikely to launch a massive nuclear attack while their boss was in New York. And what was it that caused this problem? Well, radar echoes had bounced back from the moon as it was rising over Norway, and they were misinterpreted by this new echo analysis software, because no one involved in the design of the modeling software ever imagined that the moon might reflect radar waves back to Earth, and they would be interpreted as a massive echo coming from Russia. I like this little quote I put here from Picasso, of all people, Pablo Picasso. "Computers are useless," he said. "They only give you answers, but they don't really give you intelligence." A last example, and this one's kind of funny. The Spanish Navy spent $680 million of building a state-of-the-art submarine, only to discover that it was too heavy to float. So it was a submarine that could submerge once and never come up again. They had to actually lengthen the nose off the submarine and lengthen it dramatically to get it to float. And the problem that caused it was a decimal error in the calculation of buoyancy for this ship. So that's a quick roundup of why model risk is universal. It's not limited to finance, which is going to be the focus of the rest of my presentation. But I want people from other industries to be aware that in finance, we've been dealing with model risk for over 20 years, and especially since the crisis of 2008, we've learned a few things. Other industries, particularly Boeing, could benefit by taking a few pages from our book and the techniques that we have learned to recognize and mitigate model risk. So I'm going to talk briefly about what is a model, what is model risk, why should we care about it. I've already given you many examples why we should and why we can't eliminate it. And I'll talk about the 3 lines of defense against model risks that have been developed for use in finance. So the introduction, the critical baseline document for model risk management in finance is a document called SR 11.7. That says SF up there, but that's a typo. It's SR 11.7, which was issued by the Federal Reserve Board and the OCC jointly in April of 2011. It really set the baseline, the standard for model risk management and model risk discipline as performed by all conforming banks in the United States. Had been so well written and effective that it's become the de facto standard for almost all European and Asian financial institutions. So here's a primer quick primer from SR 11.7. What is a model? Is a quantitative method, system, or approach that applies statistical, economic, financial, or mathematical theories and assumptions to convert input into quantitative estimates. There's a large amount of controversy about the difference between a tool and a model, but models basically rely on assumptions. Different implementations will not necessarily arrive at identical realizations. Tools do not involve assumptions. So a tool is like a spreadsheet that maybe adds a column of numbers or just uses a simple formula to do calculations so that all implementers would get the same results. Different implementers of the same model may often get different results because they're based on assumptions and statistical analyses. What is model risk? Is the potential for adverse consequences from decisions based on incorrect or mistaken model outputs and reports. In other words, it's the risk that of poor outcomes for firms that decision have model dependencies. And the consequences are, at least in finance, I can say nobody loses their life because of a serious model risk or model failure. We lose money, we lose careers, maybe businesses go under, but no one dies. And in the examples I've shown you before, in critical systems, model risk can be lethal. And finance can lead to financial loss, poor business and strategic decisions, and damage to a bank's reputation. But no one dies because of model risk in finance. And for that, I've always been very grateful. I'm not going to go into detail on this slide, but SR 11.7 introduced this concept that we all use in finance of the 3 lines of defense against model risk. Each line expected to be independent of the other 2. The first line of defense is the model supervisors, users, and owners and developers, those who identify the need for a model, design a model, implement the model, develop it, test it, and put it into production. That's first line of defense. But very often that's associated with a business unit in a bank. Second line of defense is an independent group for model validation and governance. And independence is a critical word here because the second line of defense has to do an independent review and validation of models produced by the first line of defense. And if it's done properly, no model goes into production that hasn't been approved by the second line of defense. The third line of defense is internal audit, and their job is to make sure that the first and second lines of defense are doing what they're supposed to be doing, following their own procedures and policies. Internal audit does not itself always do independent testing or replication, although they can go to that extent if they get involved enough in reviewing the work of first and second line of defense. I say this because I initially started my validation team at Morgan Stanley within internal audit for reasons of independence. So we performed both second and third line of defense functions there, and I became very familiar with both of them. So what factors give rise to model risk? Some of the factors are the model design risk. This is all coming directly from SR 11.7. The model may be inaccurately calibrated or incorporate inappropriate assumptions or maybe design errors. Then there are possibility of implementation errors, inappropriate conceptualization errors in coding. There could be errors in input data. And there's intrinsic uncertainty, which is the innate risk arising from the ability of any abstract model to fully capture the fully complex nature of what is being modeled. Put another way, all models that are useful succeed if they succeed because they reduce complexity. They simplify whatever it is we're trying to understand. And in doing so, they also assume a certain amount of risk because what is being omitted from the model may present itself downstream as another form of risk. And the last factor is incorrect use of models. Right model, wrong application. So there's also model usage risk. I mentioned this, risk that models may be used for other than their intended purpose or outside their intended scope, such as using a Black-Scholes option model for bond options, or by users who are not adequately trained with insufficient knowledge of the model's limitations. And in finance, there are many examples of this. A flawed correlation model and liquidity mismanagement at LTCM in 1998, the meltdown of 1998, flawed implementation of the Basel 2.5 comprehensive risk model at JP Morgan in 2012 that resulted in the London whale debacle. I give an entire hour-long presentation for my risk class at JPM, at NYU on this London whale fiasco at JPM, because it's a classic lesson in the cost of models that have not been properly validated, embedded, and tested. What is model validation? Well, SR 11.7 addresses four major aspects of model risk management: governance, validation, inventory, and internal audit. Of the four, I consider the most important for mitigation of model risk to be governance and validation. On the left is my favorite quote on that you'll hear often on this topic of model risk. It comes from George Box in 1987. Remember, all models are wrong. Practical question is, how wrong do they have to be to not be useful? So this is what model validation is all about. Without going into the details, which is covered in my paper, which I'll give a reference for later, the true purpose of rigorous model validation is really to separate models that are useful from models that are not. That's what it's all about. Models in finance will never be correct in the ways that the principles and laws of physics are accurate, or laws of thermodynamics. Models in finance are all based on assumptions that may become invalid as markets evolve. So the real question is a model useful? And even if it was useful last year, doesn't mean it'll be useful again next year, which requires retesting of models every year the way they're used in finance. 6 things about model governance. While model validation addresses risks within a model, governance is a much broader umbrella, and it impacts all 6 phases of the model. One way of thinking about it is that model validation talks about risk, or addresses risk within a model, whereas governance addresses the many risks outside of and between models. A robust model governance framework will provide complete coverage for policies, procedures, roles, responsibilities, reporting to the board, model inventory, risk assessment, and documentation. As you see, many topics that go well outside the domain of a simple model validation. Differentiating between tools and models is a current area of intense focus at most financial firms today, and for reasons I'll go into a little bit later. Many models end up hiding in the shadows because owners would prefer, most first line of defense model owners would prefer to have their whatever it is classified as a tool rather than a model. Then there's the challenge of model inventory, which SR 11.7 requires model inventories to be complete and accurate. And I would argue that any firm that relies on voluntary attestation by model owners and developers can never be sure that its inventory is actually complete and accurate, because there are models that will never be declared as models. The numerical measures of model risk are very diverse in nature, so there's really no easy way to quantify model risk the way, say, market risk and operational risk are reduced to dollar figures. Most banks will use a qualitative scorecard type of approach that combines many different quantitative metrics and expert judgment to risk rate models. So this is a quick review of it was considered to be the life cycle of a financial model. Starting on the left, and well, I note at the top, model governance touches on every phase of the life cycle of the model. Starting on the left, we begin with initiation and identification of models, developing and testing. That's all first line of defense. Then the critical role of second line of defense. In the middle is independent validation and approval before the model can go into production. Then it goes into production and undergoes continuous monitoring. The next phase is ongoing maintenance and change management. Any significant changes to a model have to go through a validation review process. That's something that Boeing did not do when it changed it, made last minute changes to its critical flight control software. They never did any review of the impact of the last minute changes that were made, and 2 plane crashes resulted. And the final phase of the life cycle on the right is model retirement. So all of this leads up to my interpretation of SR 11.7 into what I consider to be the 14 most important challenges confronting today's model risk managers. And I'm going to have to move through this pretty quickly because I don't want to take up too much more time. But here are the top 14 challenges as I've defined them. And I've put this into a detailed paper, which I'll give a reference for. First challenge is establishing a comprehensive model governance framework. Second challenge is developing a holistic approach to model risk, which means embracing the firm's entire model ecosystem, which includes risk outside of models. One example of a risk outside a model is interdependencies between models, which is an area that most banks have a great deal of trouble actually identifying, because there's a great deal of data and model interdependence between models that run within a firm's ecosystem. Establishing a model risk as the fourth leg of a firm's risk framework, or it could be fifth leg if you include liquidity risk. At many banks today, the awareness of model risk has been raised to the same level as traditional market credit and operational risk. Fourth challenge is finally incorporating big data and machine learning into model validation and model risk management processes. You know, we have a number of members from people from Wells Fargo who have joined the OpenMRM, and believe that it's safe to say that Wells Fargo is well ahead of most other banks in incorporating machine learning and big data into the model validation process. They have an entire team dedicated within model risk management within the second line of defense just to the application of machine learning for validations, whereas most other banks are just getting started in this area. 5 is the challenge of challenger and benchmark models. I'm not going to dwell on that too often, or too much, but SR 11.7 requires that for every champion model that's submitted to validation, there's also should be benchmark models that are used to test it. And benchmark models are alternative ways of computing the same result to do sanity checking on a model. This becomes even more important with machine learning models because of machine learning models tend to be very opaque and hard to understand. So it's really important to have a lot of benchmarks to sanity check them. Model identification, is it a tool or a model? I already talked about that a little bit. Challenge number 7, what to do about vendor models. This is a black box problem. Many banks will rent or buy vendor models, but vendors don't like to tell anyone how their models work. And so validating vendor models becomes a huge challenge. I talk about this a bit more in my paper. I won't go into it now, except to say I try to avoid validating black boxes at all costs if I can. Make the vendor perform the validation on his own model and provide proof of validation instead. Much better approach for any bank. Creating and managing a complete and accurate comprehensive inventory. I've mentioned the problems with this that I ran into, particularly at Morgan Stanley Credit Suisse, is that inventory is reliant on voluntary attestation by model owners, meaning people who have models, who created models, are expected to raise their hands and say, I have a model, and it can be submitted to the model validation team. Why is that a problem? Well, many model owners would rather not go through all the pain and suffering that they might endure going through a formal validation process. So they really try to have their software classified as tools or near models that don't require nearly as intensive an effort for validation. So there's a constant tension between first and second line of defense. First line of defense would rather nothing gets declared as a model. So they can just say they're all tools and they don't have to go through the detailed review process mandated by SR 11.7. Second line of defense, on the other hand, is responsible for reporting to both senior management and to regulators at bank exams that they have comprehensively validated all the models that are in use at the firm. There's that constant tension that will probably never be resolved. If I can get to it, I'll show you some funny excuses that model risk managers have encountered from model developers about why it's not a model. Creating a dynamic model inventory. I've written a whole paper on this topic. By dynamic, I meant model inventory that contains information about model usage, how often, how, when, and where when models are being used. If you're not familiar with how this works in banks, very few banks really have a complete picture of how, when, and where their models are being used. They have a lot of information from validation about the weaknesses of the models, about the underlying theory, about who owns the model, but you start questions to a model owner, like who's using your model, how often is it being used, you find that they start giving you finger in the wind estimates, because very often they don't know who their entire set of users. So I suggested ways, and this gets to this topic that you'll see talked about in this forum about intelligent agents embedded within models. I propose a solution to this by not relying on attestation from owners, but embedding agents and models that advertise their existence every time they're used, which can solve a lot of problems in understanding model usage. Challenge number 10, how to validate qualitative expert judgment models or models that incorporate expert judgment. SR 11.7 makes it very clear Anything that takes in data and produces a result, an estimate, is a model that has to be validated. And if the processing is just a set of experts who sit around a table and say, this is a 1 in 100-year event, this is a 1 in 50-year event, that's what they do in operational risk, that's still a model that has to be validated, which presents a great deal of challenges. Data quality is a topic often overlooked because quants mostly focus on methodology, but I don't need to convince anyone, I'm sure, if the data is no good, the output's no good either. At most firms, certainly the firms where I've worked, we had separate groups that were responsible for data quality. In my opinion, that should be responsibility of internal audit to look at the data, the quality of the data going into the models. Number 12, estimating model risk on the aggregate. As I mentioned, there's no easy way to quantify model risk in dollar values. So getting an aggregate firm-wide estimate of model risk is quite a challenge, and yet it's a requirement of SR 11.7. Challenge number 13, tiering models by risk rating. There's a whole process that most firms go through in risk rating their models, because if you can rate a model as low risk, it requires much less attention than a model that's rated high risk. And lastly, improving the quality and thoroughness of model documentation. That's always been a shortcoming, because the people who develop models don't seem to like to write about them or put down what they've done in writing. They don't get, part of the reason is they don't get rewarded for it. They get rewarded for building models and putting them into production. The documentation is almost always a second or third afterthought. So that's something that needs to be addressed. I've never seen documentation in my 20 years of experience that completely explained how a model worked to the level of detail that we could reproduce the model by only looking at the documentation and not talking to the developers. At the bottom, I give a little reference. If you want more detail on this, you can see the paper that I wrote in 2019. I think it's 21 pages long. The top 14 challenges when I go through this in a lot more detail. So I'm going to wind up with just mentioning that all leading firms today engage in this process of assigning their models into high, medium, and low risk tiers. And it's partly motivated by a single line in SR 11.7 that provides a potential escape clause for model owners. And that line is: the range and rigor of validation conducted prior to first use must be in line with potential risk presented by use of the model. There's a way now to avoid validation if you can say there's very little potential risk. So model risk tiering allows firms to substantially reduce validation requirements for many of their models by bucketing them into different risk tiers. And as a result, model owners will often go to great lengths to have their software widgets bucketed into the lowest risk. This gets back to what I mentioned, the constant tension between first and second line of defense. Second line of defense is responsible for making sure all models are validated before they go to production. First line of defense just wants to get their models into production as soon as possible. So this is one of the main reasons that a rigorous model validation process, a model discovery process, will invariably reveal many potential models that are hiding in the shadows. So what is it really? A true model, a near model, or a non-model? First line of defense, as I said, would prefer not to have any model classified, anything classified as a model. Second line of defense has to answer to senior management regulators. So there's the tension between them. So model owners will often go to extraordinary lengths to convince MRM, that's model risk management, about why it's not a model. Now, here are 11 choice evasions that were submitted by model risk managers at a recent MRM conference. All of them are absurd. Some of them are funny. I actually managed to get this published in that paper on 14 challenges. I included this as appendix at the very end of the paper because I was sure the editors wouldn't allow me to put jokes in a paper, but surprisingly, they didn't say a thing about it. So evasion number one, it's not a model because it's just a calculation. It's not a model because we're still building it and this is just the first draft. Evasion number three, it's not a model because it has minimal impact. Well, that may be true today, it's going to be true tomorrow. It's not a model because I say it isn't. 5, it's not a model because an upstream input into a downstream model cannot itself be a model. That's just completely bogus, wrong. Upstream models provide input and downstream models are also models subject to validation. It's not a model because it's a vendor supplied solution and that's the vendor's responsibility, not ours. Wrong. SR 11.7 makes it very clear that someone has to validate the vendor supplied solution. Either the vendor or the user has to do that. 7, it's not a model because it's only used for accounting and it's not subject to the level of qualitative judgments. 8, it's not a model because we can't explain it to senior management. That's one of my favorites. If we can't explain it, then it can't be a model. It's not a model because we only use it for reporting to regulators. Regulators get a real kick out of that one. Number 10, it's not a model because we don't have resources and we don't want to document it or model count, and hence we really prefer not to consider this to be a model. And finally, the lamest of all reasons for why it's not a model. It's not a model because it's just a spreadsheet, and spreadsheets cannot possibly be models. Okay, so that's my presentation. I'll just mention I have some publications on this topic. You can get copies of these on request to me. The first one, Should No Model Know Its Own ID, when I talk about the advantages of embedded agents and models. Number 2 is the top 14 challenges, which is a much more detailed presentation. You've just done a cursory review in this presentation. And lastly, a smarter model risk management will follow from making smarter models, where I go into more detail about why we should be embedding smart agents inside our models the way all the tech companies do in their smart printers and smart devices. And yet, by that standard, models used in finance are pretty dumb because to put it in more colorful terms, models in finance don't know who they are. They're assigned model IDs, which are external to the model, but not embedded actually inside the model code, the way the serial number of my iPhone is embedded in its onboard firmware. I mentioned that at the bottom. If you want to see a more complete hour-long presentation on the history of model risk, I use some of those examples at the beginning. There's an hour-long presentation, and the link right below. It's not available on YouTube. And that's the end of my introduction on model risk governance and validation. So, any questions or comments?
That was really good, John.
But no questions.
I think the
John, I have one
more
question.
than 8 minutes would allow.
John, if I may, I wanted to ask a question about the algorithm transparency. I think you talked about design. So is that where you would consider that if there's a choice of algorithms, choose the one which is simpler or more transparent?
I'm sorry, you're talking about transparency of machine learning models?
Basically, machine learning models plus the algorithm that you choose, right? So regression versus decision tree versus deep learning.
Yeah, I mean, this is a universally recognized problem that machine learning models tend to be opaque. And so a lot more emphasis needs to be put on making the output explainability. And I think that's one of Augustus's presentations. He says what's important is explainability rather than, or interpretability of the output, rather than explaining how the model works, explaining the output and justifying. And that's where one advantage of machine learning models is that you can generate lots of benchmarks, machine learning benchmarks, to validate the output of those models. But that's an ongoing challenge. The other challenge with machine learning models is the vast, their appetite for vast amounts of data. They're not subject to the tyranny of traditional quant models that are restricted by the number of dimensions. It's called the curse of dimensionality. Originally, that quant models tend to only have a few dimensions of input, whereas machine learning models just gobble up data from many sources. And I think David Palmer from the FRB makes a big point about this in his presentations on machine learning models, that emphasis on data quality has to really be increased when you're validating machine learning models, because as he put it, a lot of secondary and tertiary sources may be consumed by the ML model, and they really have to be inspected for quality because we all know a lot of biases come with data that models can obtain from public sources,
right?
Geographic data.
Absolutely. So no. So my question was that in the challenges you said in the framework before that you were explaining, right, where you said the design should be simpler, and you have few other attributes there. Would they cover machine learning models as well, or are you more looking at more of the quant models?
I'm not sure what you mean when I said the design should be simple. Where did I say that?
I think you were a few slides back. I think you had something there. Sorry.
We definitely hear that from a goose.
Well, I mean, he'll say that for machine learning models, but many of the quant models are quite complex, and that's not going to change. And that requires a lot of, I think, well thought out testing, particularly stress testing. I haven't had time to go into a lot of detail on that, but stress testing is absolutely critically important for all models to understand how they're going to behave under different conditions. I don't think I've ever said that models have to be simple. It's better if they're simple. Let's put it that way. Simple models are to be
That's fair.
preferred.
That's fair.
But you can't avoid that. You have a lot of stochastic path-dependent models and binary tree models that are quite complicated.
Right.
And I think quant models tend to be like that. I would definitely prefer a world in which all models were simple and easy to understand for sure. Mention a few words about stress testing. That's again where Boeing could have saved a lot of lives if they'd simply taken a few pages from our book of model risk discipline, and they had done some simple stress testing on that MCAS software. Because, and I didn't go into this, but that software was designed to take input from two different sensors on the fuselage of the plane called angle of attack sensor. And for particularly nefarious reasons, the chief test pilot for Boeing insisted that for this particular plane, the 737 MAX 8, they should only take input from one sensor. Okay, that's a single point of failure in a life-critical system. Is an absolute violation of a cardinal principle that there should always be redundancy. Now, he did that to avoid additional scrutiny from the FAA. And by the way, he just got indicted and should have been indicted because that to me is criminal negligence. But an independent validation team, almost certainly, if they were competent, would have found that. They would have replicated that MCAS software, run it in a flight simulator, and said, hey, we're only getting input from one of these angle of attack sensors. Now, what happens if that sensor is damaged and it's constantly telling the software that the nose is pitched up at 20 degrees, which is what happened in both of those crashes. The sensor was telling the software that the nose was pitched up regardless of whether it was straight and level or in a dive, and it kept forcing the nose of the plane down. And the second part that's never been explained by Boeing, which would have also been flagged by a validation team, is that that software had final authority over the pilots. That's absolutely inexcusable. I mean, it's as if your cruise control in your car had control over the car in spite of your commands. I mean, if you drive a car with cruise control, you knew as soon as you touch the brakes, make any changes, it disconnects. And that's the way autopilots work on all aircraft. But this system was put in the background. It was like a silent monitoring system that would take over and seize control of the aircraft. Worse, it was not documented anywhere. In fact, documentation was removed from the user's manual before it was actually distributed. So there's almost criminal negligence involved here. But my point is that if Boeing had an independent validation team, they almost certainly, if they were competent and their warnings had been adhered to, they would have spotted these problems before the plane ever got put into the air. As far as I know, I don't think Boeing has still embraced the ideas of independent validation of their software. I don't know what kind of quality control they do. They're under massive amount of scrutiny right now and lawsuits. But it's not just obviously Boeing. I think the makers of these autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles that drive themselves, could also take a few lessons from the validation teams, because it's clear to me that they did not perform a lot of their testing in poor light conditions, because the majority of these accidents in self-driving cars have occurred at night under poor light conditions. And this is something I've seen all the time in model validation. The first line of defense always was expected to do its own testing before they ever presented a model to second line of defense for validation. And we would look at that testing, and the first question they ask is, what did they not test? Because that's where the skeletons are going to be buried. The model owners don't like to break their models. They like to test them under conditions they know that models will perform well. It's just natural a bias. And it clearly, same thing happened with these autonomous vehicles. They tested their recognition software under good lighting conditions, not thinking about what happens late at night when the only illumination is from the headlights of the car. Can that edge detection software really find the edge of the road? And there are plenty of examples where these cars go right off the road when it hits a curve. And
John, I think we're just about at time, but I would say that you brought up some really good examples there. But one of the things, and again, go back to a goose, is he always says, try to be nice. It seems like this automatically sets people up for some confrontation, and maybe in a future meeting we can talk about, operationally, how does model risk mitigate some of the confrontation, but still get the solutions that you need between the lines of defense? Because to your point, they probably need to be there. but there's probably ways that you can make sure you're making the model break on corner cases, but not aggravating the people so much, right? That are building the models. I know it's a balancing act, but maybe that's a topic for another meeting. What do you think?
Possibly. I think the only ones who would really be aggravated are maybe Boeing and the people who design those self-driving cars.
Well, I think some of that's kind of interesting because some of it's like when we're thinking of model in this context, like we think in a very general sort of the description that comes from SR 11.7, right? But like I think the manufacturing giants or like the military industrial complex, NASA and others would kind of challenge that notion because they're making a strong assumption on the deterministic nature of the math that they're using. So like instead of using things that are very stochastic in nature, they're using things that they believe are fully deterministic and that those are adequate representations of the physical world. And so, they have very elaborate proof verification systems to do automatic theorem proving for like things that they're trying to design and engineer around to simulate like wind conditions and shearing forces and all this sort of stuff, right? Very physical models of the thing. And that's very different from the more like statistical perspective of like, I'm going to estimate risk and volatility under certain conditions and I can back test that using historical things. So I think we're in the right in this sense that like that holistic view is coming whether we like it or not. I mean, the European Union, NIST, and other governmental entities are looking to apply these policies more broadly, and I think a lot of it is going to end up echoing sentiments that have already been applied to banking.
Yeah, NASA is a good example. I'm sure they do a great deal of testing, but if you remember that example about the Mars orbiter, somebody made a major mistake in not converting units. And that, again, would have been picked up by an independent validation team, or should have been.
Yeah, but John, I will press. I mean, how many people would have bet the price of oil would go to negative number, or that Russian SWIFT payments would go to zero, right? I mean, look, there are things that probably have happened in the real world in the last couple of years that have just been unthinkable. So anyway, we're over time. I think this is a great discussion. But maybe we can put these as topics as a follow-on or drive this up. John, fantastic information, great way to get things started. Any final comments from folks?
Yes, this was great. Thank you, John.
Thanks for attending.
All right, we will try to have another meeting in about a month. If we can go faster, we will. Definitely would like to make sure and see how we can get more industry participation as well. But I just, before we close out, I do want to show you one thing. John, I think you have, or maybe I have.
Stop sharing. Yeah.
Just to kind of show you, I posted this and I kind of talked about this. These are the people that have kind of watched some of the LinkedIn posts, and you can see, Citi, JP Morgan, Deloitte. Anyway, maybe I'm breaking some confidentiality here, but it's just interesting across the country and the world where people are coming in from. And I do think that we have momentum and interesting topics on Slack. We've seen some pretty long threads get started, but I don't want to just have it'd be nice if we could figure out steps to move forward. And one of the things that Girardi and I talked about was how to move the POC forward. And we have some proposals on that perhaps in the next meeting we can talk about as well. Because there are some design requirements that I think we're going to have to do, even if we're going to do a toy model to get started, just to get our hands wet, feet wet, whatever the term is. So with that, I think I'll close it up unless anybody has any other final comments, anything from anybody. All right, we'll try to post this recording, and thanks for everybody for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks, Josh.